The CIA used to be a faceless organization. 3 letters, redacted documents, men in suits who didn't exist on paper. The entire operating principle of an intelligence agency is that you don't know what it's doing. You don't know its officers. You don't know its methods. You don't know its agenda. That was the deal. Now you can't open YouTube without one of them sitting across from a podcast host, relaxed, telegenic, viral, casually describing operations that were classified for decades.
Who was the ugliest woman I've ever seen in my life. Like, you want to avert your eyes. Like, she came off the side of Notre Dame. She was a stone gargoyle with a giant mole right here with a giant hair coming out of it. That kind of ugly. And my boss says, okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to fuck her. And I said, what? I said, have you ever seen her? And he said, I know, but we're the good guys, and you're gonna have to take one for the team.
How they recruited foreign spies.
Headquarters says, we want you to pretend that you're gay. I said, oh, come on, you guys. No, we really need the information. You gotta pretend that you're gay. I said, okay, I'll do it.
How they ran black sites. How they waterboard prisoners while the official government position was that waterboarding wasn't happening.
They strip you naked, they chain you to an eye bolt in the ceiling so you can't lay or kneel or sit or anything. You can't get comfortable in any way. They chill the cell to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and then every hour somebody comes in and throws a bucket of ice water on you. But we killed people with that technique. His heart actually stopped during a waterboarding session, and the doctor revived him just so he could be tortured more.
How Jeffrey Epstein was almost certainly an intelligence asset.
I believe very strongly that he was an Israeli access agent.
Did he work for the CIA?
No way. The CIA's job is to collect foreign intelligence. What foreign intelligence did he have? He's spying on Bill Clinton and Bill Gates and Prince Andrew. That's the Israelis.
How the CIA can remotely take over your car and drive it off a bridge.
He revealed that the CIA has developed technologies to, for example, remotely take over your car by hacking into the chip, right? Why would the CIA want to take over your car? To make you drive off a bridge, maybe? To make you drive into a tree and kill yourself? To make you drive into an abutment and make sure that there's no way you can survive because they've got the thing going 140 miles an hour and you can't control it?
Delivered calmly, like an anecdote about the weekend. I spent weeks going through these appearances, the clips, the books, the congressional testimony, the agency's own published regulations, trying to understand what was actually happening here. Because something is structurally strange about all of this. And the answer I found is not the one I expected. To understand what is happening right now, you have to go back to 1947. Not last year, not the last decade. 1947. Because what you are watching on these podcasts is not new. It is not a product of the internet age. It is not a consequence of YouTube's algorithm or Joe Rogan's reach or the collapse of legacy media. It is the latest iteration of a system that has been running without interruption for longer than most of the people watching this have been alive. In 1947, President Truman signed the National Security Act into law. That document created the CIA. And the mandate it gave the agency was precise. Foreign intelligence. The collection of information from outside American borders. The CIA was not authorized to operate domestically. It was not authorized to influence the American press. It was not authorized to shape what American citizens believed about their own government. That was the legal boundary. It lasted approximately 6 years. By 1953, the CIA was running a covert program called Operation Mockingbird. Not alleged, not theorized, documented. The program recruited American journalists at major newspapers, wire services, and broadcast networks to plant CIA-approved stories in the domestic press. Editors were on the payroll. Reporters were on the payroll. The news Americans were reading had, in some cases, been written to serve the interests of an intelligence agency they were never supposed to know existed. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a public record. In 1977, journalist Carl Bernstein, the same reporter who broke Watergate, published a 25,000-word investigation in Rolling Stone detailing the full scope of Mockingbird. His sources included CIA documents and agency officials speaking on record. The piece named names. It named organizations. It named the editors who had agreed to cooperate and the reporters who had been recruited. That same year, the Senate Church Committee, a formal congressional investigation into intelligence agency abuses, confirmed the CIA had systematically used the American media as an instrument of its own foreign policy objectives. Congress confirmed it. The agency admitted it. And then, for the most part, everyone moved on. Here is what that history means for what you are watching today. The CIA did not discover media influence in 2020 when podcasting went mainstream. It did not look at Spotify's download numbers and decide for the first time that controlling public narrative was a useful strategic asset. It arrived at the podcast circuit with 70 years of institutional experience, a known playbook, and a detailed understanding of exactly how much the American public will accept before it stops asking questions. The only thing that changed is the format. Here is what most people assume when they watch these videos. They assume the CIA hates it. They assume these former officers are rogue voices. Men and women who served, grew disillusioned, left the agency, and are now speaking freely, unburdened by classification, institutional loyalty, or the threat of consequence. The whole appeal of the format rests on that assumption. The insider who finally got out. The operative who can now tell you what they couldn't tell you before. That assumption is wrong. And the reason it is wrong is not a theory. It is not speculation. It is a regulation written by the CIA, published by the CIA, and enforced by the CIA that has been in place for decades. It is called the Pre-Publication Classification Review Board. Here is what the agency's own regulation states. Any form or means of communication, including oral or electronic, must be submitted to the review board before it reaches the public. Books, speeches, blog posts, op-eds, podcast talking points. The regulation does not carve out an exception for a casual interview on a platform the CIA didn't anticipate. Oral communication is explicitly covered, and the obligation is not temporary. It does not expire when an officer retires. It does not lapse after a decade of civilian life. It is lifelong. Every former CIA officer who has ever sat across from a podcast host and described a covert operation, named an intelligence asset, or explained how the agency recruits broken people, did so with the CIA's prior approval.
Yes, you are right that we are all subject to pre-publication review. I'm lucky in that I've written 8 books, 9 books, the 9th one's at the publishers now. And so I've told all these stories 1,000 million times. They've all gone through pre-publication review. So I can answer the questions and I can tell the stories. Now, if there's something new that I want to tell, and I've been out of the agency for 22 years now, so there's nothing new, I would have to, of course, resubmit to pre-publication review and have it cleared.
Not after the fact, not reviewed in retrospect, before you ever heard a single word. That is not an allegation. That is what the regulation says. Now, here is where it stops being a document and starts being something you have actually watched. John Kiriakou spent 14 years as a CIA operations officer. He led the raids that captured one of the first major al-Qaeda figures taken after September 11th. He was the first United States government official to publicly confirm that the CIA was waterboarding prisoners.
They strip you naked, they chain you to an eye bolt in the ceiling so you can't lay or kneel or sit or anything. You can't get comfortable in any way. They chill the cell to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and then every hour somebody comes in and throws a bucket of ice water on you. But we killed people with that technique. His heart actually stopped during a waterboarding session, and the doctor revived him just so he could be tortured more.
He went to prison for it. 23 months in federal custody, not for the waterboarding, but for confirming it.
Did any of the people who were torturing other people wind up in jail?
Not a single one. The torturers.
I'm sorry, it's so crazy.
It's nuts. It's nuts. The torturers didn't go to jail. The people who conceived of the torture, the people who funded the torture, appropriated taxpayer money for the torture, the people who implemented it, nobody went to prison but me.
He is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most credible voices in this entire space. A man who paid for the truth with his freedom.
Any secrets you want to tell us?
Oh, that got me 2.5 years in prison. I should probably keep my mouth shut.
On The Diary of a CEO, the host asked him directly whether former CIA officers are subject to pre-publication review when they appear on podcasts. This is what he said.
Yes, you are right that we are all subject to pre-publication review. I'm lucky in that I've written 8 books, 9 books, the 9th one's at the publishers now. And so I've told all these stories 1,000 million times. They've all gone through pre-publication review. So I can answer the questions and I can tell the stories. Now, if there's something new that I want to tell, and I've been out of the agency for 22 years now, so there's nothing new, I would have to, of course, resubmit to pre-publication review and have it cleared.
What Kiriakou is confirming in plain language is this. His podcast appearances are not spontaneous disclosures. They are the delivery of pre-vetted material. The stories he tells on Rogan, on Diary of a CEO, on every platform that has given him millions of views, those stories have already been read by the CIA. They were cleared before he told them the first time, and he is only permitted to repeat them. If he wanted to say something new, he would need to go back to the agency and ask permission. He has been out for 22 years. He went to prison for telling the truth, and he still needs the CIA's permission to speak. Let that settle for a moment, because here is what it means in practice, and this is where the floor drops. As of 2015, the CIA's pre-publication review board was processing 184,000 pages of declarations per year. That number is not a leak. It is not a whistleblower estimate. It is the figure the agency itself disclosed. 184,000 pages, reviewed, approved, modified, or rejected every single year. Every podcast quote in this video went through that process. Every book excerpt, every viral clip, every bombshell disclosure that racked up 3 million views and made you feel like you had finally seen behind the curtain. The CIA read it first, which means one of 2 things is true about everything you have heard. If John Kiriakou's theory that Jeffrey Epstein was a Mossad intelligence asset is accurate.
Here, I think the reason why even in death he's being protected is I believe pretty strongly that he was a Mossad access agent. Piers asked me if I thought Jeffrey Epstein was an Israeli Mossad agent. I said absolutely, positively yes.
The CIA reviewed that claim and decided you were allowed to hear it. If it is not accurate, the CIA reviewed that claim and decided it was comfortable letting you believe it anyway. Both outcomes serve the agency. Neither outcome is an accident. If the torture disclosures are the full truth, the CIA approved the full truth for release. If they are a curated version of the truth, the CIA approved the curated version. If they are, as declassified documents later suggested, a softer account than what actually happened, the CIA signed off on the softer account while the harder documents remained classified. Every viral moment of outrage, every revelation that felt like exposure, every clip you shared because it finally confirmed what you had always suspected, curated, every single word. But this is not just about the CIA. This is about what you do every time you watch one of these clips and feel like you are finally hearing the truth. Think about the last time you shared one. A former intelligence officer, calm and authoritative, describing something the official record had denied for years. Epstein as an asset, the waterboarding program, the Tuesday morning kill list.
John Brennan had the Tuesday morning kill list meetings because the tech got sophisticated enough that you could just write up a list of people that you want to kill that week. And you dish out the assignments. The teams go out, they kill everybody that's on the list, and then they meet next Tuesday and get that kill list.
You watched it. You felt something shift. You sent it to someone. You wrote something in the comments. You felt, for a moment, like you were one of the people who actually understood what was happening, as opposed to the ones who were still asleep. That feeling is real. It is also exactly what the system was designed to produce. There is a term for what you were experiencing. It is not a conspiracy theory term. It is an intelligence term used inside agencies, taught in tradecraft, documented in declassified literature. It is called a limited hangout. A limited hangout is the deliberate release of embarrassing, controversial, or damaging information, not to expose the truth, but to control how much of it the public receives. You give people enough to feel satisfied, enough to feel informed, enough that they stop looking for the part you didn't give them. The confession becomes the camouflage. The revelation becomes the lid on a deeper revelation. This is not theoretical. Former CIA officer Mike Baker, a man who has appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience at least 21 times, whose Twitter handle is literally MBCompanyman, whose website is mbcompanyman.com, deployed a textbook limited hangout on air and described it as though it were too obvious to merit serious discussion. When asked about CIA interference in foreign politics, he said,
Sex. Of course that's what we're doing, right? Of course we're trying to influence hearts and minds. Of course we're infiltrating organizations to try to influence the direction of a government.
The admission sounds like honesty. It is framed as honesty. It lands like a man who is simply too seasoned to bother with denial. What it actually does is close the conversation at exactly the level the agency is comfortable with. You heard the confession. You felt the truth land. You moved on. And the questions that would have required a different kind of answer about domestic operations, about active influence programs, about what is happening right now rather than what happened 20 years ago, those questions never got asked. Because the limited hangout already gave you something to hold. Now here is where this stops being about CIA officers and starts being about the infrastructure they replaced. In 2002, the Pentagon launched a program. It ran until 2008. It recruited more than 75 retired military officers and deployed them as independent analysts across every major American television network: Fox, CNN, NBC, CBS, ABC. These men appeared on camera without disclosing their Pentagon relationship. They were given classified briefings. They were given talking points. They were flown on free trips to Iraq. Many of them simultaneously held positions at military contractors who stood to profit directly from the wars those analysts were endorsing on air. Internal Pentagon documents called them message force multipliers. In 2008, the New York Times published a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation by David Barstow documenting the entire program. Named officers, named networks, internal memos obtained and published. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was documentary. Not one major television network covered the story about themselves. There was a near-total media blackout on a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation into how the media had been used as a weapon. What Walter Pincus and the Washington Post documented across that period was the structural blueprint for everything that followed. Not a conspiracy. Program. A named, budgeted, institutionally approved program, run not by a fringe operation but by the United States Department of Defense, that proved conclusively that retired officials with credible careers could be deployed into media spaces to shape public understanding of ongoing military and intelligence operations. And that audiences, given no reason to question the framing, would receive that information as independent analysis. The CIA podcast circuit did not invent this model. It inherited it, and then it improved it, because the Pentagon program required television networks as intermediaries. It required producers and bookers and broadcast schedules. It operated through institutions that could, at least theoretically, ask questions. The podcast circuit removed all of that. A former CIA officer, a microphone, and 40 million subscribers. No editor, no producer, no standards and practices department reviewing the segment before air. Direct to your earphones. Which brings us back to you. When you watched those clips, when you shared them, when you felt informed, when you experienced that specific sensation of finally understanding something the mainstream media wouldn't tell you, you were not circumventing the operation. You were completing it. You were the last mile of a distribution network that runs from a pre-publication review board at CIA headquarters directly to your social media feed. You were not the person who saw through the system. You were the person the system was designed to reach. We were not supposed to see behind the curtain. But what if the curtain was moved deliberately, and we were supposed to see exactly what is behind it? What if transparency is the operation? This is not new. That is the thing that should unsettle you most. Not the podcast circuit, not the pre-publication review board, not even the Tuesday morning kill list delivered with the energy of a standing meeting. The thing that should unsettle you is how old all of this is. How many times it has happened. How many different civilizations in how many different centuries arrived at the same conclusion about the same problem and solved it the same way. Every empire in history controlled its narrative. Rome burned books, not occasionally, systematically. The index of prohibited texts was not a fringe policy. It was an institutional mechanism for determining which version of reality the population was permitted to hold. Stalin did not merely censor photographs. He had people physically removed from images after they were removed from history, so that the visual record and the political record would align. The British Empire did not just occupy territories. It controlled what those territories could read, teach, and remember about themselves, because it understood that a population with access to its own history was a population capable of resistance. They all understood the same thing. Control the information. Control the population. Not through force. Force is expensive, unstable, and visible. Through the images inside people's heads. In 1922, a man named Walter Lippmann published a book called Public Opinion. Lippmann was not a radical. He was not a conspiracy theorist. He was one of the most respected political journalists of the 20th century. A two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, an advisor to presidents, a man whose analysis shaped American foreign policy for decades. And in 1922, writing from direct observation of how democratic societies actually functioned, he identified something that had no satisfying solution. He called it the pseudo-environment. His argument was precise. Human beings do not perceive the world directly. We perceive a representation of the world, constructed for us by the media, by institutions, by the people and organizations who control the flow of information between events and audiences. We think we are responding to reality. We are responding to a picture of reality that someone else built. The quality of that picture, its accuracy, its completeness, its agenda determines what we believe, what we fear, what we consider possible, and what we consider unthinkable. Lippmann called this the manufacture of consent. He believed informed democracy was structurally impossible as long as the images inside people's heads were controlled by those with the power and the motive to control them. Not because people were stupid, because the world was too large, too complex, and too deliberately obscured for any individual to perceive it directly. We were all necessarily working from pictures, and the people who painted those pictures held a power that no election, no legislation, and no constitutional guarantee could fully constrain. He wrote that in 1922, 2 years before the CIA existed, 74 years before the internet, a century before a former intelligence officer could sit in a podcast studio and deliver pre-approved disclosures to 40 million people who believed they were finally seeing past the pictures. Lippmann described the problem. What he could not have anticipated was that someone would read his diagnosis and build an industry around it. That someone was Edward Bernays. Bernays was Sigmund Freud's nephew. He took his uncle's understanding of the unconscious mind and applied it with complete deliberateness to the question of mass persuasion. In 1928, 6 years after Lippmann identified the pseudo-environment, Bernays published a book called Propaganda, not as a warning, as an operational manual. His opening argument was direct. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. He did not write that in secret. He published it. He was proud of it. He believed, with genuine conviction, that the engineered management of public opinion was not a corruption of democracy but a necessary feature of it. That the complexity of modern society required specialists who could translate reality into pictures that populations could act on. He called it engineering consent. He built a career and an entire industry on its application. Lippmann described the problem. Bernays wrote the solution. And the CIA, which launched Operation Mockingbird in 1953, at precisely the moment Bernays was at the absolute peak of his influence and his methods were being absorbed into every major American institution, has had 70 years to study both, refine both, and adapt both to every new media environment that emerged. The progression is not a conspiracy. It is a curriculum. Mockingbird required journalists. It required relationships, payments, editorial agreements, the cooperation of institutions that could, under sufficient pressure, be exposed. The church committee exposed them. The whole apparatus had to be rebuilt. The podcast circuit requires none of that. It requires a former officer, a regulation the public doesn't know exists, and an audience that has been culturally primed by decades of institutional distrust, by the collapse of legacy media, by the very conspiratorial sensibility that makes these disclosures feel revelatory, to receive pre-approved intelligence as though it were forbidden fruit. The difference between Mockingbird and what you are watching now is not ideology. It is not intent. It is not even scale, though the scale is incomparably larger. The difference is deniability. Mockingbird recruited journalists to deliver the message. The podcast circuit recruits the audience to deliver it themselves. Every share, every clip, every comment that says finally, someone is telling the truth. You are not consuming the operation. You are distributing it. Lippmann wrote about the pictures in our heads. Bernays built the machine that paints them. And somewhere between 1922 and now, the machine learned to make us feel like we chose the picture ourselves. That is the refinement. That is what 100 years of iteration produces. Everything described in this video so far has been structural. A regulation, a review board, a historical program, a philosophical framework, a Pentagon document, systems and mechanisms and institutional architectures that operate at a scale too large for any individual to fully inhabit. So here is what it looks like at the level of a single human life. John Kiriakou grew up in Pennsylvania. He studied Greek and Middle Eastern affairs at George Washington University, completed a master's degree in legislative affairs, and was recruited into the CIA by an agency psychologist while working as a graduate teaching assistant. He was 22 years old. He spent the next 14 years inside the machine. He was sent to the White House at 26, the day after Iraq invaded Kuwait, to brief the President of the United States on the identity of a senior Palestinian militant. He described that moment on the Joe Rogan Experience with the specific disorientation of a young man who had not yet learned to treat the extraordinary as routine.
We all sit down. The president tells us, sit down. We sit down and the president says, well, now what do we do? And everybody turns and looks at me. I said, Mr. President, as you know, Iraqi troops crossed the border at 2 o'clock this morning. And I said, actually, he's the co-founder of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. The vice president shouts, Jesus Christ! And then the president says, gentlemen, thank you. We'll take it from here. And I remember saying to myself, my friends would never believe in 1,000 years what I was doing right now. They wouldn't even believe me if I told them. That's what an analyst does. When I switched to operations, again, the job was very straightforward. It was to recruit spies to steal secrets. But then if you're involved in counterterrorism operations, there are a lot of extras that you have to be trained in. So you go through the normal spy training. This is how you ingratiate yourself. It's something called the asset acquisition cycle. Spot, assess, develop, recruit.
His friends, he said, would never have believed him if he told them where he was or what he was doing. He barely believed it himself. After September 11th, the agency sent him to Pakistan as chief of counterterrorist operations. In 2002, his team located Abu Zubaydah, at the time considered one of the most significant al-Qaeda figures in custody. They found him building a bomb. He tried to escape across rooftops. He was shot. He was kept alive. What happened next defined the rest of John Kiriakou's life. CIA officials approached him and 13 other officers about being trained in enhanced interrogation techniques. Kiriakou was the only one of the 14 who refused.
I was one of 14 people asked if I wanted to be trained in the use of what they called enhanced interrogation techniques. I was the only one of the 14 who said no. Besides being immoral and unethical, I thought it was illegal. It was illegal.
He called it immoral. He called it unethical. He called it illegal. A colleague, a psychiatrist, pulled him aside and told him quietly that they called him the human rights guy behind his back, and that it was not a compliment.
He said to me one day, buddy, you know they call you the human rights guy behind your back. And I said, yeah, I know. And he said, you know that's not a compliment, right? And I said, Steve, I'm right and they're wrong, and I'm comfortable with my position.
A senior mentor was more direct. He told Kiriakou, this is a torture program. Somebody is going to go to prison. Do you want to go to prison? Kiriakou said no.
First of all, let's call a spade a spade. He said, this is a torture program, and somebody's going to go to prison. Do you want to go to prison?
He meant it. He thought that was enough. It was not enough. In December 2007, a reporter from ABC News contacted him, Brian Ross. Kiriakou agreed to the interview. He decided that whatever he was asked, he would tell the truth. He said 3 things on camera that he knew, in the moment of saying them, would change the course of his life. He said the CIA was torturing its prisoners. He said torture was official United States government policy, not the result of rogue officers acting alone. And he said the policy had been personally approved by the president. Within 24 hours, the CIA filed a crimes report against him with the FBI. He was charged with 5 felonies, 3 counts of espionage. Espionage carries the death penalty. He spent the next 10 months defending himself. The legal fees reached $2 million. When he was bankrupt, the espionage charges were dropped. He pleaded guilty to a single count of passing classified information to a journalist. He was sentenced to 30 months. He served 23. Not one person who designed the torture program went to prison. Not one person who authorized it. Not one person who funded it. Not one person who implemented it. Not one person who waterboarded a prisoner or chained a man naked to a ceiling bolt in a 50-degree cell and threw ice water on him every hour until his heart stopped, and then revived him so they could continue. John Kiriakou went to prison for confirming it happened. He came out with PTSD, no pension, 5 children, and no one willing to hire him. He turned down an approach from Russian state media for 8 months. Then he said yes because they were the only ones who had offered him work. By any measure, legal, biographical, institutional, John Kiriakou is the most credible voice in this entire space. He has the career. He has the operations. He has the prison record. He has the documented proof that he told a truth the agency did not want told and paid for it with years of his life. He is also the person the agency allowed to become the most prominent former officer on the podcast circuit. Hold that thought, because here is where the story develops a problem. On the Joe Rogan Experience, Kiriakou described the waterboarding of Abu Zubaydah. He said it lasted approximately 35 seconds. He said that after 35 seconds, Zubaydah broke, cooperated, and the waterboarding stopped. He presented it not as a defense of the program, but as a statement of fact. 35 seconds. Then it was over. Declassified documents tell a different story. According to the Senate Intelligence Committee's report on CIA detention and interrogation, a document that took 6 years to produce, reviewed 6 million pages of internal CIA records, and was declassified in 2014, Abu Zubaydah was waterboarded at least 83 times in a single month. Not 35 seconds, 83 separate sessions. The classified record described the sessions as far more brutal, far more prolonged, and far less clinically controlled than the version Kiriakou had described. When this discrepancy was raised, Kiriakou had an explanation. The CIA, he said, had fed him disinformation internally. He had reported what he was told. What he was told was not the truth. He was a victim of his own agency's deception. That explanation may be entirely accurate. It may also be precisely what a limited hangout looks like at the individual level. Because here is the function that Kiriakou's version served, regardless of his intent. Before the full classified record became public, the dominant narrative in circulation, delivered by the most credible possible source, a man who had gone to prison for whistleblowing, a man no one could credibly accuse of carrying the agency's water, was that the waterboarding had been brief, controlled, and effective. 35 seconds. Then cooperation. The version that reached the public first through the most trusted possible voice was the version that made the program sound like something other than what the classified record later showed it to be. Whether Kiriakou knew what he was doing is almost beside the point. He could only say what he had been cleared to say. And what he had been cleared to say turned out to be a version of events that protected the program far more than the full truth would have. On the Carlos Watson show, the host asked him directly whether he was a good liar. This is what he said.
Are you a good liar?
I think I am a good liar, yeah.
Why?
Why am I a good liar? Because deep down, I believe we're the good guys. And lying in service of my country was something that I became good at.
You know, at the CIA, you're a trained liar. And this is why the divorce rate's so high. It's the highest divorce rate of any entity in the US government. It's upwards of 80%.
He was not being cynical. He was being honest. That is what makes it land the way it does. A man who believes he is one of the good guys. A man who went to prison to prove it. A man whose credibility rests on the documented fact of his sacrifice. And a man who, by his own account, is a good liar, trained, practiced, and morally at peace with deception in service of something he believes in. Those things are not contradictions. They are the same thing. This is what the pre-approval mechanism looks like when you give it a face and a biography and 23 months in federal prison. Not a villain, not a plant, not a man without conscience or cost or genuine courage. A man who can only tell you what he was cleared to tell you, and who, because of everything he suffered, is the last person you would think to question. The tragedy of John Kiriakou is not that he lied. It is that even a man who paid for the truth with 23 months of his life cannot give you more than the CIA decided you should know. And if that is true of him, the most credible, the most costly, the most unimpeachable voice in the room, then ask yourself what it means for the rest of them.